Hey guys, Jake Raby here, Flat 6 Innovations. I'm the inventor of the IMS solution, and I'm going to be taking you on a quest to understand about the M97 IMS bearing used in the latest iteration of the Porsche M9X engine. So in today's video, we're going to learn a lot about the M97 bearing. This is the 6305 large single row bearing. We're going to talk about some myths. We're going to talk about my personal experiences with it. We're going to talk about what you should do if you have a car that has one. We're going to talk about what you should do if you have a replacement engine from Porsche for a car that was older than 2006, that was replaced after 2006, and therefore would be fitted with this 6305 M97 bearing. And last but not least, we're going to also discuss what you should be worried about if you're the owner of a Porsche that has this larger diameter single row 6305 M97 intermediate shaft bearing. So the focus of this video series is on the M97 intermediate shaft bearing found in that latest version of Porsche M9X engine. Now, if you click the link below, you'll be able to travel back in time to circa 2017, when none of us even knew what coronavirus was at that particular time, and you'll be able to experience a bit of an understanding with Vu Nguyen of Porsche Club of America while he came here to visit and learn about these bearings. And I was able to take him through all the things associated with IMS bearings. There's a 4-part series there that will help familiarize you with the intermediate shaft, what it is, where it is, what it does, why we have it, which bearings are in which cars, and all that. And because you can click below to get that link, we're not going to cover any of that in this video, okay? Because in that, you actually learned that Porsche used a dual row bearing in the earliest days, and that particular bearing was of the same diameter as the bearing used a little bit later on, which was the single row bearing. This is what they call the single row 6204. This is a dual row variant of a 6204, and both of these have the same outer diameter. Now, after I show you one thing using my Porsche crankcase here to illustrate this, these two bearings are going to go aside for the remainder of this video and not be discussed, because these have been beaten like a dead horse, especially the 6204 single row that was really the topic associated with the class action lawsuit from 2011, Eisen versus Porsche, okay? So now what I want to show you before we get these two out of our mindset is the fact that the earliest bearing, I'm going to go through the top of this crankcase here and show you that it can be easily extracted through an access port in the back of the crankcase, okay? This is where your intermediate shaft would lie. So here's your intermediate shaft. It would lie inside the crankcase, okay? It sits longitudinally inside the crankcase, just inside that orifice, and the bearing for it is right here. So when I came up with a procedure to extract this bearing and perform a retrofit, we were able to do that simply because at that time the diameter of the early dual row as well as the 6204 single row bearing were smaller than the access port in the crankcase. Okay? Again, I will say smaller than the access port in the crankcase. Here is a cutaway view of our 6204 most problematic intermediate shaft bearing. I want to show you yet again. I can take that one, come right down, and it also very easily passes through this access port in the crankcase. Now, it's almost just like an engineer designed that, right? It's almost like the size of that port was there to allow for this bearing to be extracted. even though per the factory this was not a procedure that was ever expected, called out for, and in the earliest days they told me that it couldn't be done. So again, this bearing will pass straight through, would be extracted out of the intermediate shaft and come out into our extraction tool, and then a new bearing could be put in place of it. Either a replacement dual row ceramic hybrid bearing or a replacement single row ceramic hybrid bearing, or you could also do the Pro version of the single row, which is a single row Pro, and that puts a dual row bearing in the space of the single row. And then of course you can do my plain bearing intermediate shaft solution, which gets rid of the ball bearing in its entirety. It makes the engine, basically backdates it to the design of that of the Metzger air-cooled engine, thereby getting rid of all those failure components that can destroy your engine from collateral damage and foreign object debris. So now that we've discussed that first generation dual row bearing, we don't need it anymore. We're not talking about that. We've discussed the 6204 single row. We don't need this anymore. We're not talking about that either. So what we are going to talk about is the often misunderstood M97 6305 large single row IMS bearing. Okay? Now, you already noticed that we could take those earlier bearings, we could pass them through the crankcase orifice that the factory gave us. Before I show you the next bit of information, I want you to understand that even when Porsche changed to this large diameter bearing, they never changed the access port in the crankcase. It was so very close to the end of this engine's lifespan, the 9 Alpha 1 was already being developed, already being tested. They knew it was the last hurrah for this engine. There was no reason to change the crankcase casting because it was going to be omitted. So where we end up with this is, we now have a bearing that has a physical limitation that keeps us from retrofitting it with conventional methods. I'm going to go over the reason why this bearing doesn't need to be retrofitted unless your engine is apart anyway, a little bit later on. But now I want to show you the most crucial thing that you're not going to learn in any other videos that are out there at this time. I'm going to bring this through just like I did the earlier bearings, and it won't fit. The pathway is smaller than the bearing. So the inside diameter of the pathway is smaller than the outside diameter of the bearing. You're not getting it out of there, okay? Now, before I go further with this, I want to get a bit of an elephant out of the room. Under no circumstance do I believe you should make modifications to your crankcase to allow this bearing to be extracted. There are means of doing this, but all of them come with a stake that I would not want to pay if I was the one that was making the gamble. So with that being said, I consider this bearing, as of today in June 2021, non-retrofittable, and I currently see no reason to retrofit this bearing. So based on my direct first-hand experience seeing these failures, I would not be comfortable telling someone they need to go through any procedures to remove this bearing from this shaft if it was factory fitted to your engine unless that engine is apart. At that point in time, it makes all the sense in the world to go ahead and upgrade this bearing to either an IMS solution, which can be fitted to this shaft with one small adapter, or fit it with a replacement ceramic hybrid bearing offered by Ellen Engineering that is also made to the specifics of the 6305 bearing. But you're only going to do that if your engine is already apart. If you guys have had a failure of a 6305 and it's been confirmed, meaning you have pictures of the bearing in pieces and it has grenaded your engine, I want you to submit a ticket to flat6innovations.com through the submission ticket program. I'll be able to see that. I want to see pictures of it and I want to see your story about it failing. I don't think I'm going to see many of those because as of today, since 2006, I've seen 3 with my own naked eyes. So now I want to cover future service. So we've already determined if you have this large 6305 bearing even if you replace it with a like item while your engine is apart, it's still the same outside diameter. It still will not come out of the port because it's still too big. So at that point, since you're going to use LN Engineering components because we've invented and developed these things and we're the first on the market and continue to be the best, then you're going to have a couple of choices. At that particular time, you can end up using the IMS solution, which is, of course, my invention that's patented by U.S. Patent 8992089 and others. And this omits the ball bearing in its entirety. And it uses just a bushing to go in the back of the crankcase. Now, this is not a new IMS solution. This is one that's used and has went through a bit of a hard life during testing. But one thing I want to show you about that is it passes through the port in the crankcase just like those other bearings do, and that allows you to service this in the future if you ever needed to. Now, the IMS solution is currently the only permanent solution to the IMS bearing problem because everything else that's out there requires some level of service interval, whether or not the people who are manufacturing, selling, and marketing it will tell you that. If you go back and look at the bearings as designed, they will all have some level of service interval if you look far and deep enough into where those bearings were actually supposed to be applied. So to fit the IMS solution to an M97 engine requires nothing more than an adapter bushing that is sold by LN Engineering. It's a product that we came up with to support the IMS solution. It also will allow any of the other earlier variants of products to be applied to an M97 bearing as well. So if you wanted to make your M97 shaft be retrofittable with any other technology, that adapter bushing will allow you to do that. That way you can pull it out and you can put another bearing in without full and complete engine disassembly being necessary and without any modifications being made to your crankcase. You don't want to ever have to modify your crankcase at this pathway area to facilitate some level of intermediate shaft retrofit. So to further clarify, the only thing that needs to be modified if you decide to fit my patented IMS solution to your M97 factory fitted intermediate shaft is you have to make a small cut here at the bell housing area that allows this AN-3 fitting to pass through the bell housing area. Now, there's some opposition out there that will do anything and everything they can to hate any kind of product they can. They've developed nothing, they've come up with nothing, or they are friends with copycats who have also done nothing because they just copycat. And they want to use anything they can to say, oh, well, Porsche won't take your block back if you cut the case or whatever. Well, guess what? That's a moot point because as of today, the Porsche factory short block program is coming to an end. They've actually been trying to sell all the rest of the blocks they have at Kolbenschmidt to my company and others like us. So that's a moot point because that's going away, and it probably already has gone away for most people who are watching this because of the designation of their crankcase. So that's an argument that's null and void. Those people don't know that because they're not on the inside like what we are. They haven't gotten those emails from Kolbenschmidt trying to sell these blocks because there's no longer a demand for them. So, at the end of the day, if you just have to make a small notch in your engine's bell housing to omit the largest problem this engine has, that's a very small price to pay because it's not going to cause any loss of structural integrity to the block. And the only thing it's going to do is kind of make it where you can't buy an engine that you probably really didn't want anyway. So if you've already gone through the procedures of enlarging the crankcase bore here to fit some other bearing or to remove your factory bearing for some ungodly reason, never fear because there's always more. The team at LN Engineering has created an adapter bushing that will allow this crankcase housing bore to be repaired and restore the original size so you can go back with something like the patented IMS solution or one of the other proven retrofit bearing products offered by LN Engineering, okay? Just to clear the air, I'm an inventor, I'm a developer, I don't sell anything. I haven't been associated with sales, marketing, or anything associated with putting this IMS solution in anybody's hands since 2012. Before that, my part was done since 2009. I'm just taking a great bit of pride in the things that I've invented, I've developed, and the things that permanently address the lifelong problem associated with the M96 and M97 Porsche engines' intermediate shaft bearing. Another huge topic, tons of misinformation, tons of inaccuracies, sometimes just blatant lies, is what engine is fitted with the M97 bearing. This is especially true in the 2005 model year because, as you've heard to this point, I've been referring to the M97 bearing as a 2006 to 2008 model year specific component. That is true. However, some 2005 model year Porsches have the M97 bearing. There are a set of directives out there. One is by vehicle identification number, the other one is by engine number. These are supposedly accurate types of references that can be used to see which bearing you have. Other times, people will go in and they'll look and see if their car was part of the Eisen versus Porsche class action lawsuit to determine which bearing they have. Because if they would have been part of the class action lawsuit, that would be that 6204 single row bearing, the smallest, most problematic bearing. And if they're not part of the lawsuit, they believe they're okay because they think they have the M97 bearing that is the topic of this video series. What I will tell you from direct experience, checking both the VIN reference and the engine number reference along with the Eisen reference, in most cases it is inaccurate at best. Recently I had a customer who did not find his VIN number in the Eisen reference, found his VIN number as having the M97 bearing, and therefore he believed that he was safe because he had the large bearing, the big bearing, the 6305 bearing, the one that doesn't fail, the one that Jake says is good. He thought he was good because he used these references as a directive and he put them as they were written in stone with no deviation. One reason is because they come from the factory. But he suffered an intermediate shaft bearing, and upon disassembly, we found that his bearing was a 6204, the most problematic bearing of all, the one that was the focus of the class action lawsuit, and the one that should be retrofitted in every circumstance with no deviation. If you have a 6204, you retrofit it because those bearings are the most problematic of all. So he thought he was safe, he thought the directives were accurate, he thought the references were solid, and he ended up with a $25,000 engine failure as a result. So with that being said, you might ask, how in the hell do I figure out which bearing I have? I can't use the VIN, I can't use the engine number, I can't use the Eisen class action lawsuit, so what can I do? The main thing that you can do is, especially if your car is a manual, the next time you have the clutch serviced, when the engine gearbox is separated, take the opportunity to have the technician see if the bearing is the large style, like this one, that has a 22 millimeter nut that retains it into the flange, or if it's the earlier variant that has a 13 millimeter nut that holds it into the flange. They are very easy to tell the difference of, and we're going to throw an image up here so you guys can see which one of these is which. If you have the 22 millimeter, chances are you're going to be safe. If you have the 13 millimeter, have him stop in his tracks and seriously consider a retrofit procedure with some proven LN engineering component, preferably the IMS solution. So if your car is a 2005 model year only, you can't really assume which one you've got. If I was going to assume anything, I would assume that the bearing is not retrofittable, that I have the earlier, more problematic bearing, and I would work to quantify that. Now, the way I would do that is I would try to sneak a bore scope in here. Now, there's a video that we plan on shooting for our paid members here at RenVision that if you have a certain characteristic with your bore scope and it's got a certain size probe like what this one does, you can sneak into one area of the bell housing to gain a visual reference as to which retention nut you have, the 22 millimeter or the 13 millimeter. You have to get some ambient light in there. You have to get creative. You have to put a lot of effort into it. But there are some chances to be able to see what bearing you have without removing the engine and gearbox. Some people have also went through the practice of slightly splitting apart the engine and gearbox while it's in the chassis. So with that, you'll be able to see which flange you have, and if it's the 13 millimeter problematic nut or the 22 millimeter nut, indicating that you have the M97 6305 bearing. So in closing with this segment, what you're going to do is only trust a visible visual reference as to which bearing you have if you have a 2005 model year car. Now, also, everything that I'm stating here is assuming that your engine hasn't been rebuilt. You haven't swapped out something from an engine provider that may have used some earlier part, that the engine is still the one that was in the car, that somebody didn't put a different shaft in it, or any of that. So there's always a question mark. There is always a variable. These cars are getting old now. A lot of engines have been rebuilt. Some people put whatever shaft they can find in there, and you can put an earlier shaft into a later engine. So there's always a question mark. But most people are going to have a non-molested engine. It's going to be a 2006 to a 2008. It will have the M97 bearing. Now the rest of this video I'm going to dedicate to those people and the people who want to buy a car that has this particular bearing fitted to it from the factory. You guys with the 2005, you've got to visually verify which bearing you have, and please, under no circumstance, trust any reference material that's out there. I don't give a damn where it comes from. So while I do not like a ball bearing that is sealed and put inside of an engine to support the intermediate shaft, I have to be honest with you and tell you that this bearing has proven itself over the years. It is very robust. They just don't fail. I've only seen 3 since 2006, and we've seen a tremendous amount of these engines come in with bore scoring, broken rod bolts, and all kinds of other stuff over those years, okay? This M97 bearing is big, it's strong, it's robust, and at this point in time, they are not failing. Now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, more time of service, more experience may change my opinion. But as of today, in June 2021, I trust this bearing. I don't use these in my reconstructed engines here at Flat 6 Innovations because I only use what I invented. All of my engines see my patented intermediate shaft bearing solution, the IMS solution. That plain bearing that does away with all those wear parts. This is all we use. I don't use anything else. I invented it to take advantage of the design. Never really planned on it going to the market, but it has, and tens of thousands of people have been able to benefit from that. So while I don't like this bearing and the fact that it's a sealed ball bearing inside of an engine filled with hot engine oil, it simply has proven over time, when we pull them out, they don't wear, they don't fail, they don't erode, we don't have problems with them. And I truly believe the only time that you should worry about replacing this bearing, or even considering it at this point in time, is if the engine is apart and you can remove the intermediate shaft, hold it in your hand, and extract the bearing on your workbench. That makes sense. Even if you replace it with a like item, even if you replace it with a hybrid ceramic item, or even if you adapt it over and put the IMS solution in it. You don't want to leave this part in that shaft and put the engine back together, because that's going to be penny wise and pound foolish. Just because the part that you neglect is always the part you're going to wish that you would have addressed later on. So we've discussed the 2005 model year, we've discussed the 06 to 08 model year. Now what I want to discuss is everything up to 2005. Your 97 through 2004 Boxster, Boxster S, and 911 variants. And the reason I'm addressing those is because if you have a replacement engine that came from the factory post 2005, it can and should be fitted with the M97 bearing inside the M97 shaft. The reason why is once Porsche went to a newer design They would always make that design retrospective. So that way, the design can be co-applied to earlier engines as well. So once they got away from that small diameter bearing, they never went back to it. They only went newer, later, greater, bigger, better, more robust. That was a wise decision. So case in point, you have a 1997 base model Boxster, one of the first cars built with the M96 engine. Your engine was replaced in 2007 because whatever happened to it, doesn't matter what. At that point in time, factory reman and brand new engines were still available, and they were dirt cheap. I could sometimes buy those engines for $5,000 brand new from the factory. We would take them apart, build them our way before they were ever started. That was a dream come true for us. Now, the good thing about that engine is it would be fitted with this M97 bearing because it was sold in 2007 while this was the latest, greatest, newest thing in those engines. So if you look at your engine serial number, there's a couple of designations we're going to throw on the screen that will help you understand if your engine was a remanufactured engine or if it was a new factory engine based on the engine serial number. Now, that engine serial number is found here on bank 1. At this area, you will see an M96/ whatever or an M97/ whatever on this engine designation area. Now, this is where it gets confusing. Even if your engine says M96, it can still have an M97 bearing if that was a new engine or a remanufactured engine sold after 2005. There are some weird things that play into this. What if an engine was built in 2004 and it was sold, it stayed on the shelf for 3 years somewhere? Well, you can't really reference your invoice because it would say 2007 when the engine was really built in 2004. In those cases, the engine number doesn't do you any good, okay? There's not very many of those out there. There was a big boom. The economy was booming. Those engines really didn't stay on the shelf that long. During the recession, they did. But most of these engines were manufactured with this bearing during the recession. So I do get a lot of people wondering about if their engine has been replaced. Was it the latest and greatest, even for their earlier car? And I get that. You know, if I was looking for one of these cars and it was like an 02 or an 03, and I wasn't going to reconstruct the engine or whatever, then I would try to buy one that had this bearing as well. That makes sense. People have gotten really wise, really smart over time, and they know what to look for. Now, one good way to have a good idea of which bearing your engine has, outside of the number, is what fasteners are used on the crankcase. About the time these bearings were implemented into the engine, they started changing the fasteners that hold the crankcase together and hold other things onto the crankcase. They went from a hex head to an inverted Torx. So now we're going to give you a couple of images that show you what an early engine would look like, or earlier than M97, as well as what an M97 bearing fitted engine would probably look like. Again, this is absolutely not 100%. It can't be used as a sole reference, but it can give you a better idea of how early or how late your remanufactured or new engine might be if your car is earlier than a 2005. All right, so moving on. We've determined what cars have it, what cars don't have it, what references to follow, what's BS, what's not. So now, what do you do if you own a car that has this bearing? How do you keep it safe? Everybody wants that one silver bullet to go kill the werewolf. Well, there's no silver bullet. The only thing that I will tell you is even improperly maintained, even people who use the oil that everybody tells them to use that I wouldn't use, these bearings still live, and they still live a good long life. So, what I would tell you to do is change your oil every 6 months or 5,000 miles, whichever comes first. Meaning that the 6 months is just as important as the 5,000 miles. Also, if you track the car a lot, you want to pay attention to the way the engine behaves, because what we've learned is the engines that have had failures of this M97 bearing have been cars that see a lot of track time. And I'm talking about a guy that tracks the car 5 times a month sometimes, or he goes to the track for 3 or 5 days at a time. He's an instructor, he's a heavy driver. That guy is who I've seen had 2 of the 3 IMS bearing failures associated with the M97 bearing. So if you're that guy, you might want to look into an elective retrofit procedure, meaning split the case and go ahead and enhance everything else in the engine while you're there, because you are going to push this engine hard enough to break rod bolts, have other issues happen to it outside of this bearing, okay? At the end of the day, the M97 bearing has proven itself. I wish that I could sit here and tell you bad things about it, because I don't like ball bearings. The only engines I've ever worked with that I liked with ball bearings were high RPM 2-strokes, which I put ceramic hybrid bearings in, as well as turbine engines and jet engine powered helicopters. Those are the only 2 things that I've ever seen that liked a ball bearing. I don't like it in an internal combustion piston engine. And at the end of the day, there's just too many parts here to wear. You've got too many things that can create foreign object debris. You've got too many things that can come apart. These bearings are proven, they're strong, they're robust. If you have a car fitted with this bearing, you can sleep well at night, change your oil often, change your oil whether or not the mileage tells you you need to, and enjoy your Porsche. So now that you're finished watching this video, I want you to subscribe below. We're also going to throw the link back up here to the Porsche Club of America series back in 2017, which went over all the 4 stages and things associated with intermediate shaft bearings, how they fail, what they are, where they are, all that sort of thing. That is certainly required viewing for you to understand the things that I've gone over in this video. So like us on Facebook, subscribe here. I'm Jake Raby for Flat 6 Innovations, saying goodbye from Ren Vision.